of what they think the current moment is. What does the ANC Congress promises? What are the dangers? What are the possibilities? So before we begin, I would like to introduce you to our panelists. We've got Pindile Kunene, is the lady sitting in the middle. She's from Chisimani Center of Activism. It's based in Cape Town. She had to fly all the way from Cape Town to be with us today. We've got Pearl Pillay, who's from the Youth Lab. She's seated at that side, on the right side of Pindile. And I've got Zugo Gondlipi, who's from the ANC Youth League, who's seated here. So these are our panelists today. And before we get their perspectives, I just want to ask Bumi just to tell us a bit about Rethink Africa, what it is, and just briefly, given the fact that time now is not on our side. Thanks.
So Rethink Africa is a non-partisan and youth organization. So what we do is we offer young people a platform to engage. We've hosted a lot of dialogues with regards to fees must fall, on mining, on youth unemployment. We also do community work, like helping. We focus a lot on food insecurities and climate change in the Val, where we go to churches and HIV centers and we fundraise for them and we teach them about climate smart agricultural practices. Right? A lot of work that we have done is just working a lot with university students, right? Because that's where we're based. Our focus is not actually political. Our focus is social, political, and economic issues. So we just don't focus on political issues. So what we do also, we just focus on like what our pillars are: thought leadership, stakeholder engagement. If I forgot some of the other directors here, we'll talk to her after the event. So I don't talk a lot, so just I'm mumbling it because I'm not a speaker in the organization. I'm behind the scenes. The speakers are not here. Our limelight are not here today. Essentially, we also do consulting work. So we consulted a lot for Oxfam because these are the NGOs that we work with. We work a lot with international NGOs like Rosa Luxemburg, Oxfam, UN Women, Hendrik Bull, and embassies, right? And we also, one of the biggest projects that we did 2 years back was national minimum wage, and that saw one of the directors advising Abu Cyril in the presidency. And the other big campaign that we did was on climate change and food security. So we're very diverse and versatile, and what we always tell people that come to our space is that it's not just our space in the way we welcome you. Rethink Africa offers a platform for young people to engage, and this is why we invited you. I hope you're going to enjoy yourselves. And then if you have anything to ask me, Suzokulma after the event. It's just that it's Katsa Hambane. I can't continue. Thank you so much, guys, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amy. You want to introduce your colleagues from Rethink Africa?
Okay, so our co-founders are Ayabonga Kawe, Baling Abosimamkele, there's quite a few of us. And then now the current directors that are running Rethink Africa, Jilan Chigumira, she's here.
Thank you.
And then Nompumelelo and Bandilengiti.
I just want to say that you're all encouraged to participate. Yeah? There is no particular line you must defend because we're not in a congress or we're not in a caucus. So if you've got an idea you want to express, don't feel bad that maybe you belong to a particular organization. Therefore, that organization and what it represents must always be articulated. Yes. So it should be a space for critical engagement and for rethinking new things and imagining new possibilities moving forward. So with that, I'll allow Pindile Kunene from Chisimani just to give us according to my order of things. Okay, it's fine. I'll allow to go.
Okay, thanks Temba. I suppose the interest is on what will the ANC look like from the 21st of December going on, given the fact that it is going to its national conference, and part of the interest is because of the nature of the conversations in the ANC and about the ANC that have been taking place as it builds up to the Congress, to its conference. And there are some concepts that have come up as the ANC is building up to its Congress. Things like radical economic transformation, white monopoly capital. There are questions of state capture. There are questions about the place of race and race politics in South Africa, and whether the concept of non-racialism still has a future in South African discourse, and how do we balance the concept of non-racism, unity, and so on, with the reality of racism and racialized power in South Africa. Even if you talk about access to education, it seems as though white students have a better chance at succeeding. If we talk about looking for employment, it seems as though white students and young people have a better chance at getting a job. If you look at the dominance in the business sector, it looks as though white people are the ones who are calling the shots and black people are really in the margins of the whole thing. And then the question arises, what will the ANC conference produce that can change the situation? Or can that conference actually even produce something better than what we've been handling since 1994? I speak as an involved person in a sense because I'm a member of the ANC and I'm a member of the ANC Youth League. And I would just want to frame this discussion not on what is happening now, but on why is the ANC even the center of attention about these conversations that we're having, right? I will talk about this conference as I go on, but I just want to take us back more than a century ago, like 100 years back, when the ANC was born. What is it that the ANC proposed in South Africa differently from anyone else, right? The ANC was not the first Congress to exist in South Africa. There were many congresses that existed, the Bantu People's Congress, the Bantu Convention, and so on, and all of them existed in the Cape, in current KwaZulu-Natal, and so on. The ANC's advantage and what has helped it to be dominant in South African politics for the past 100 years is the fact that it proposed something new at the time. It said, well, we've been organizing ourselves as different tribes or nations, so to speak, as Xhosas and so on, and we were not succeeding. So the ANC emerged as not a political party per se, and this is my own contribution to South African understandings of the ANC. It did not come about as a political party. It came about as what we can call a sociological institution, because it said for the first time, you are not Zulu, you are not Xhosa, you are not Tswana, you are not Pedi, you are an African. And that concept had not existed in the political imagination of Africans until the 20th century, around the 1900s, right? So what the ANC managed to do is to assert itself as an institution more than a political party, as this thing that helps people to redefine themselves and understand themselves better, right? And if you were to fast forward, for instance, to the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, when Johannesburg was developing as this industrial center of the South African economy, you know, young people would then be pushed from their homelands, right, to come work in Johannesburg. And what industrialization was supposed to do was to produce what is called a working class identity in South Africa, to change Africans away from being these people who identify as tribes and so on, but to now identify themselves as workers. But the ANC, interestingly, provided a pushback against the impact of industrialization. If you look at how Soweto is designed, for instance, some sections of Soweto are for vendors, Tsongas, Sutus, and so on, because the colonial regime was trying to prevent the formation of a common identity amongst Africans, to keep us organized as these different identities, which would then not allow us to work as a unit, right? as a united force of collectively oppressed people. We were supposed to spend our conversations priding ourselves that I'm Xhosa, therefore better than you because you are Zulu. So we'll spend extensive amounts of time indulged in our own tribal identities and not be able to fight back against colonialism as a united force. So just as the regime was designing the townships, and just as the industrial process was potentially creating a common identity of working class identity in the workplace, the ANC in communities was organizing around the idea of Africanity. It kept on saying, you are not oppressed because you are Pedi and so on. The fact that you walk from Alexandra to town on foot is not because you are Tswana and so on. It's because you are an African, and the system of white supremacy and colonial racism does not value all of us because we are Africans, and we must not be invested in these identities and so on. So it then began to organize, interestingly, at two levels. It organized black South Africans around the idea of their Africanhood, their identity, but it also then used the crisis of industrialization to create a political force of Africans that could challenge the regime. If you talk about the period of the 1940s when the first stayaways and boycotts and strikes and so on started with the Mazinga Khwelwa campaign, so they would say, we're not boarding buses, right? So everyone would walk from Soweto and Alexandra to Johannesburg CBD. It was a painful thing to do, but it was the first time that Africans really tried to shape some political force of sorts on the basis of this identity of Africanness. Now, the ANC experienced one important crisis over time, which is similar to what is happening now, around the future of South Africa. I think the ANC around the 1950s, for the first time, seriously had to contend with how South Africa must look like. This is partly because they had overestimated their strength. They thought by the 1960s they would have overthrown the regime. So now the question was, what do we do with white people? If we are to successfully defeat this thing, what do we do with white people? And in any case, as we're trying to defeat this thing, what is the role of white people who are not associating with this thing, who say we don't like apartheid as well? Do we include them? Do we not include them, right? And that is how the Pan-Africanist Congress emerged. And I'm doing this on purpose to just underscore one point. The PAC emerged as an expression of one identity in the ANC, of one political identity in the ANC. The PAC was not born out of a totally different political development. It emerged as one faction in the ANC that had lost the discussion, right? So it then organized by saying, we are not going to unite with white people. We want to do this thing our own way as Africans. Africa for Africans, one settler, one bullet, and all those other militant slogans. But the ANC was able to sustain itself at two levels because it refused to accept at the time the idea that the problem in South Africa was entirely the problem of white individuals. It said it's a problem of a system that uses whiteness as its mobilizing force and therefore pitting one person against the other. And that we need to build a South Africa that unites all of us on the basis of equality to access to opportunities and economic justice and so on. Now, fast forward to today in South Africa, especially if this conference of the ANC is shaped by what has been happening in the past 10 years. Some of these debates, if you remember correctly, emerged in the ANC Youth League more than the ANC in the period 2009 to about 2011, right? There emerged a sense after the 2008 global financial crisis that something is awfully wrong in South Africa on how the economy is operating and how basically opportunities are distributed in the post-1994 South African environment. You then witnessed again the re-emergence of that thing of the 50s. A political movement in the ANC that seems to say, we can no longer sustain a scenario where white people are still the ones who are in the driving seat of privilege, opportunity, and so on. Surely something has got to break. So the movement of economic freedom in our lifetime emerged. And it emerged really as a critique of how the economy of South Africa has been organized since 1994. So basically the argument was the biggest beneficiaries of the 1994 transition are actually white people. It's not black people. Black youth are marginalized, we don't have access to education, and so on. So we started then saying, we want free education, we want universal health care for free, we want land without expropriation because white people are in a position of advantage because of these things and so on. We want to nationalize the mines because this is the base of the South African economy and therefore those resources must belong to the people as a whole and so on. So it was more like a revisitation of the discussions of the Freedom Charter. It was as though we had moved back to 1955, 56 in a sense, right? And that movement in the ANC was unfortunately crushed by the leadership of the ANC. The expulsion of the then leadership of the Youth League, the visual collapse of the ANC Youth League was similar to what happened to the PAC in 1955 because there was a clamping down by those who were being challenged by these new voices. So they then said, we can't coexist with this noisy youth. Everyone who's going to the National Conference of the ANC wants to be seen to be radical, right? So the discussion in that national conference is going to be centered on radical concepts. I don't think a 5-day conference of the ANC alone can sufficiently determine what radicalism, what is the meaning of radical economic transformation and so on. What do we do with white monopoly capital? But what it will do, it will lock South Africa into this discussion very seriously because now the ANC would have accepted it as a formal thing. In 2011, it was only a youth league thing and it was scorned upon by the ANC. But in 2017, it's a discussion that is now taking place within the ANC as the governing party. What are the possibilities for the youth in that equation? There are two things. And of course, I suppose Pindle will expand more on those. I don't believe that it is sustainable for us to think progressive politics are an exclusive function of political parties. In fact, political parties function better when they have pressure from outside. You have to normalize in South Africa a broad consensus about the substance of politics that we need. If all of us say there is a need to enforce radical economic transformation, that cannot be left alone to us as party activists. Yes, we as party activists, we have a closer proximity to the policy-making process, but it works better when there is a general consensus outside that is putting pressure on us. Because what that achieves, it gives us a framework of accountability. It's not possible for a political, for instance, if the youth of South Africa say in one voice, we want free education, right? It's going to be very difficult for us as the ANC Youth League not to talk about free education, even if we don't like it. Because the people that we think we're representing are now imposing this conversation on us. How that must be organized is a totally different issue. But I think there is an opportunity arising out of this ANC National Conference because whether opportunistically or really, almost all the competing groups are modeling themselves as a progressive voice of change. For the first time, everyone is contending with the fact that white dominance in the South African economy is wrong and unsustainable. Everyone seems to accept that the discussion on land has to be taken up. Okay. Are we going to see expropriation of land without compensation as soon as 2018 or 2019? I doubt, and I don't think that question is as important. But what power in South Africa can no longer avoid is to contend with the fact that this is a real question. Dare a candidate go to conference and say, I'm going to expropriate land without compensation? On the 1st of January, they must then explain where to from here. And that can only happen if there is sustained pressure on them from the public to say, well, when you were campaigning, this is what you were saying. Now you are elected. Can you give us the timeline? When is this thing going to start and so on? And I think this is the part that Pindile would have to explore. Complementary forms of organizing the youth in relation to political parties. You will not wish away political parties. They will always exist. But I don't think they must be the only space where progressive politics are organized. I think they must be assisted by mass movement organization and a very consistent campaign of holding them accountable on their own commitments or their own public posture on this or that other question. I will hold it here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuko.
The way I thought about entering the discussion is to just start talking maybe about what I think are three approaches that people usually use to understand and to look at the ANC. Usually people from outside who are making analysis, or people who are also not part of the ANC and the ANC family or the ANC the alliance and all of that. So it could be people who are occupying the opposition benches. It could be what has become a very popular trade in South Africa now called, being a political analyst. And I'm still interested in what qualifies one as an analyst. I'm certainly not one, but it's, yeah. So, I mean, in terms of these three perspectives, the first perspective is what I'd like to call the Paul Bearer perspective. And Paul Bearers are basically people who stand on the side of the coffin. You know, my comrades who stand and carry the coffin. Those are the pallbearers, right? So the pallbearer perspective basically says, look, this organization is dead. The ANC is dead. It's moribund. It's not going to change society. It's not going to renew itself. Masimwab. To the ground. Bye-bye, ANC. Shaya Makharafu. Goodbye. It's over. That's the pallbearer perspective, right? It's got its own problems, and I'll come back to my critique about what is problematic about that perspective. The second perspective is what I'd like to call canon fodder perspective. Basically, the canon fodder perspective just says that, look, the ANC support, I'm not going to speak about the membership because the support of the ANC is bigger than the membership in the sense, and the organization itself. But people say, no, look, the ANC's support is mainly people who are on food parcels, on grants. It's patronage, they don't have their own independent thinking. They're not very political or politically literate, and that's why the ANC continues to enjoy the support, right? That's what I call the canon fodder perspective. And then the last perspective, in a way, is a perspective that says, and I think, Zuko, you've tried to address it somehow. You've offered a little bit of a critique from a historical perspective of this approach. This approach basically say, yaqala vele i-organization yongqowa. This has been an organization of the capitalists. They wanted black capitalists who wanted incorporation into the white structure. They didn't want to change things around. They were writing petitions to the Queen and all of that. So ANC was never going to change South Africa. It was always given to be, it was always going to be a sellout, because in 1912, look at who was sitting around the table, what were their interests, look at the approaches of struggle that they undertook and all of that. And I mean, if I'm going to start from the last perspective to give a critique, I mean, that last perspective is problematic for a number of reasons. I think it's ahistorical. It doesn't have a sense of history. Some of that history that Zuko has actually touched on, about how the ANC even assumed a mass working class base over the years. And the argument here is really that politics is not, you see, when you've got an organization, comrades, organizations are never, it's very seldom that organizations are a monolith, or are comprised by people who think the same and basically have the same interests. If we understand how organizations work, organizations are contested spaces. And at any given time, which if you have a social base or the social composition of an organization, so let's say you've got at a particular point in time, the influence of people who found themselves on the margins of urban society, who were squatting all over Johannesburg on the Rand, with the white state not being able to offer them accommodation. If you have those people predominant or dominant in an organization and occupying critical space in an organization, it's seldom the case that the language of that organization will not somewhat reflect their interests. I don't think there's been enough done to understand that. And I also don't think there's been enough done to understand what some people like Temba, who are sociologists, would call the social capital that the ANC provides. Now, this is not just food parcels, or T-shirts and all those things, but the social relations that actually form amongst people that you are in an organization with and that you're active with, right? So I'm going to make an example about myself, who used to be active. Many of my friends are ANC comrades, right? If there is a funeral at home, comrades show up. They don't have to be friends necessarily. If there is a funeral, I've experienced in many instances where someone has passed on and the ANC Women's League pitches and the ANC Women's League is there, which is why I think it's problematic when we just dismiss the ANC Women's League and say it's a burial society, as if the act of burying a loved one is not a very important act for people who are experiencing struggles, people who are in townships and all those things. It can be a very important symbolic gesture. So that's sort of my starting point to just problematize the different ways in which, and the different mistakes that I think people make in understanding the basis of the ANC support, in dismissing and underestimating the fact that even though people sometimes do not show up, as the previous elections have shown us, do not show up at the polls, but some people are very reluctant to actually give their votes to other organizations. They would rather wait for their organization to turn around or sit at home with broken hearts and just refuse to vote for whatever is wrong in that. So I think I suppose that's my way of saying, in thinking about politics of the moment, in thinking about the ANC Congress, I find it very difficult to dismiss the ANC in thinking about the future, particularly because I think the support base of the ANC is so important, and it's not only in the urban areas, it's also amongst the 18 million people who live in rural South Africa, who identify that organization as something that defines who they are. Okay, so that's the first set of issues. And then the second set of issues that I wanted to sort of talk about is that Zuko's spoken a lot about how the radical language has actually found itself at the center and outlined very nicely that you can't discount or erase the ANC Youth League of Economic Freedom in our lifetime from the moment where we are, where it's acceptable to talk about radical politics, radical policies, and all of that. There was a time in South Africa, and I think even the world over, where radical ideas or the idea of organizing society along radically different lines was discredited, right? Nobody wanted to talk for the longest time about nationalization, right? Nobody wanted to talk for the longest time about public ownership of any form. Nobody wanted to talk about even radically changing the situation of working class people in the country and the world over. And that has something to do with the changes that happened around the world in the 1980s, the ascendance of what people call neoliberalism, but also the fact that the attempt to organize the world along different lines proved to be such a disappointment with the Soviet Union, which today is represented by Russia. Russia was part of it, but the Soviet Union was bigger than that. And that was a society that said capitalism is not going to work. That was a society that actually experienced revolution, where workers 100 years ago walked onto the center stage of history, took over the factories, took over the land and all of that, and started reorganizing society along different lines. So everybody who was active along that time looked towards that society as an inspiration. Look, man, we can organize society differently. We don't always have to be ruled by the rich, the wealthy. Workers can actually control production, what gets produced, who eats what, who gets what, when and how. So a radically different way of organizing the world. Now that vision got into a serious crisis when the Soviet Union collapsed, right? And it collapsed because that dream of 1917, when workers walked into the stage of history with the peasant, people who lived off the land, it got discredited because that society became very much bureaucratized. So the democracy was shifted to the margins, and you had, one, the cult of the leader or the cult of personality. Two, there was just no political space and democracy outside of the party. So the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was the be-all and end-all of that determined political life. What used to be very vibrant ways of organizing the workplace and all of that, that was pushed aside, right, and undermined and all those things. So when the Soviet Union eventually collapses, starting with 1989. I mean, it goes way back, but the critical moment or the pivotal moment is 1989, when the Berlin Wall, which separated East and West Germany, falls down, right? That was a big symbol of the difference of the divisions between capitalism and socialism. When it falls down, and ultimately in 1991, this thing called the Soviet Union becomes history. So that affected how people thought about radically changing society or organizing society along different lines. Nobody had the confidence to speak about nationalization for the longest time, not only because of the Soviet Union, but because people were looking at Zambia and the copper mines and the disaster of the Zambian copper mines, or what happened there, and the crisis. And so, but these ideas now are coming back to the center stage. Largely, I think it's attributable to the fact that the working class youth was also, I don't think it was an invention of the brilliance of the leadership of the Youth League at the time, but I think they were unsettled by young people who, outside of employment, or if they're employed, actually occupied jobs that don't pay enough, where people have to borrow money to actually go to work, jobs that don't allow them to aspire to greater things, jobs that make them work for very long hours, but for a pittance, and all of that, in not even sometimes having a contract whilst doing those jobs. So young people who are employed as security guards, who clean, employed today, tomorrow you're out on the street, you know that type of arrangement. So in a sense, I think that youth actually unsettled the leadership at that time. And I think the voice of that youth is responsible for how we think about change today and all of that. So if I am just with the few minutes that I have, I want to just move on briefly to talk about why it's important to think about politics as something more than just the party. I think I made the argument that the party is important, and I used the example of the ANC and the role that the ANC plays, right? But I think politics is more than just the party. And in South Africa, I think there's a danger of thinking that politics is the party. And that we can't think of politics outside of the party, and it hasn't always been like that. In the 1980s, South Africa was very vibrant with many organizations that were not always organized along the party political line. So the civics and all of that, who took a stance against oppression, against racism, against apartheid, but which were not strictly party machines, in a sense. So I think some of the dangers in thinking about what's currently happening now is that I think we face a serious, given what is happening in the ANC now, and I think most of us can admit that the ANC is experiencing a crisis of sorts. You don't have to be an expert to basically understand that. So if you look at the ANC and its role in the state, right, as the incumbent that is in charge of running the wheels of the state, and let's look at the example of public ownership. The idea of public ownership today is in crisis because people look at Eskom and the mess that is happening in Eskom, basically, which has a direct impact on the tariff hikes and how much we pay for electricity. If it's not this leader who's got the hands in the public purse, if it's not this one who stole from this one, if it's not this one who gave money to his friends or who hired 9 family members in her office and then said, no, but they're South Africans, they deserve to be employed, when there's so many people out in the streets, there's a danger that people can look at that and say, oh, that's politics, therefore I don't want anything to do with politics. Politics is for the corrupt. Politics is not about changing the world. Or politics is just the art of lobbying, influencing branches, maybe dishing out money here and there. But politics is not about emancipation and freedom, which I mean, the latter is my understanding of politics, and I think it was an understanding of politics of many people who participated in the anti-apartheid struggle to change things. So there's a danger that people can become very cynical about politics, and I don't think that we should allow that to happen. And I think some of those dangers actually come from even the different experiments outside of the ANC. So when people say, okay, ANC, maybe it's no longer doing what it was supposed to do, so it sold out its historic mission, and people say we are going to try something new. When those experiments fail to take off or become disappointing, again, it becomes a knock on the idea of politics as an act of emancipation or as an act of freedom. Let me just give an example. How many of you remember the United Front? The United Front? How many of you remember the NUMSA moment? Remember the NUMSA moment? 2013. NUMSA had a special congress. NUMSA resolved ANC is no longer doing what it was supposed to do, and therefore we are going to do a number of things to actually drive the process of change. And the United Front also emerged out of that process. And the idea of the United Front was to unite everybody who can be united in the struggle against oppression, dispossession, in the struggle against the current economic hardships and everything like that. But because sometimes when we think politics, we also think the ballot. The United Front contested in a number of areas in South Africa, and some of them actually areas with a high concentration of metal workers or NUMSA workers, right? Or NUMSA members. It fared dismally on the ballot, dismally. I think in the Val they got 9 votes, which was was it 9 votes? Extremely disappointing. So sometimes people look at this thing and they, but why must we bother of thinking about politics as ANC and not leave? Because look at what happens, you get 9 votes and all of that. And I don't think it's because the United Front was not loved by people or people didn't hear its message about how things have gone wrong and how we can change and imagine something different. I think the problem is that we imagine politics to be not only the party, but politics must be the ballot. So we rush to the ballot, even before we've had a discussion about what is necessary and all of that, and then things fail and then it becomes disappointing. The EFF slightly different, but I don't have enough time to go into detail about it, but it also has some of the weaknesses, which are also about the idea of politics as becoming overwhelmingly parliamentarian in the sense, and not organizing sufficiently outside in a sustainable way, outside of parliament as a space, which I also think is a danger. Now, very quickly, what do we do, or what do I think? What is my humble opinion about how we actually think about politics in new ways? I think, one, we have to rethink what the ANC calls the motive force, or what other people would call the revolutionary subject, or what you can say, who are the agents of change? I think the way capitalism in South Africa, the way it has fragmented the people, the way it's no longer sufficient to just think, if we want change, maybe we must just look at the factory. And the factory is our best hope for giving us an organization that is sustainable and all of those things, because there are over 9 million people who are unemployed in South Africa. And not to be pessimistic, but I don't think that in the next 5 or 10 years, we'll see a change in the employment situation in this country. So the idea of work equals to liberation, or if you think about maybe organizing, maybe the factory, maybe workers in that sense, what's going to take you forward we must rethink it. I'm not saying throw workers in the dustbin of history. I think workers are very important, but I also think that workers who are outside the traditional forms of employment are important. I think the many women whose labor is not needed, who are residing in the rural areas, who have no jobs but also don't have land, should be part of how we think about the motive force, which is not to say that the ANC has not theorized these things historically, but I think things have shifted so much that we need to just revisit some of those concepts. I think the second issue, very briefly, is how we need to understand how different struggles basically intersect, an appreciation of the importance of the ANC for many people, but also an appreciation of the many struggles that are starting to happen outside of the ANC. So struggles for water, struggles against evictions and housing in many other places, and struggles sometimes that use the constitution to basically challenge the state to do certain things, whether it's to deliver public education, whether it's to make sure that water is decommodified, whether it's to ensure that the public health system gets into line and all of that. I think we need to understand how those struggles also intersect with other struggles that are more locating the problem in capitalism itself and saying capitalism is a problem, we need to undo it. I think in the past, those two types of struggles have not found a common place, because the others who are more counter-hegemonic or anti-capitalist tend to think that these ones who are contesting within the framework of the constitution that this democracy gives us are sellouts, or they don't have a broader vision of emancipation and all of that. Lastly, I think the idea of politics and the political instrument, which is, the political instrument doesn't necessarily have to be the party. Those two things are not the same thing. The political instrument is something that you use, that is used by the motive forces or the revolutionary subjects or the social agents of change to push back against that which oppresses them. That political instrument can be a coalition or a broad front that organizes outside of the electoral terrain. It can be something that is like that works with the political party. The political instrument can be a trade union or an organization of workers on the margins and all of that. So we need to broaden this understanding of what does a political instrument look like. It doesn't always have to be the party. I think the party is important because South Africans actually do like their parties, but I think South Africans are also involved in a whole range of associational politics that fall outside of the party. Whether it's the different stokvels, whether it's the different community organizations, whether I think there's a need to actually understand how the idea of a political instrument is understood, but also how it can shift and what is our role in shifting that. I think I'll end here. Thanks.
I want to move away a little bit from talking about what's happening inside the ANC and rather think about how what happens in the ANC affects what happens everywhere else, and the relationship that the ANC has with policy implementation and governance, and what this Congress means, and what the state of the ANC means for how we live outside of that space. Before I do that, I want to just give you a little bit of a brief outline of the work that I do so that you know my positionality. So I'm not here as a comrade. Those days are far behind me. I work for an organization called Youth Lab, and we're a youth policy think tank, and we do work with mainstreaming youth participation in political work and in community development. So we do this through research, capacity building, and a range of consulting efforts on how young people are best placed to affect development in the country and in the continent, and what are the ways in which governments can then respond to the needs of young people in a way that centralizes young people's participation. And so a lot of my perspectives here today will come from that sort of school of thought about, at the bottom line, what are the implications for young people that all of these different political games have. So the first thing I would say is that policy implementation and the act of policy is an everyday process. And so policy won't stop because the ANC is going to Congress. If NDZ wins, policy won't stop. If CR17 wins, policy won't stop. Because policy and governance happens both within and without politics, right? And so you people that kind of perform implementation in different ways in government often will exist regardless of what happens within a party system. And I think that there's a lot of people out there that are feeling the same way, where you might have a sense of loyalty towards the ANC, but then you see Life Esidimeni and you're like, maybe not, right? And you know for a fact you're not going to vote DA. And you might have been feeling like you could vote for the EFF and then they delivered as Herman. And now you're like, maybe it's not you guys either, right? So, and for the first time, I think we have to think about the fact that the ANC, for the first time, might not lose outright, but they're going to get shaken come 2019. And we saw this, we got arrogant during municipal elections, right? Because Asina Valo was. And then it was lit. And I think 2019 is going to be the same thing. They might not lose, but there's going to be a drastic shake-up in the political landscape that does not centralize the ANC. And so how do we think about the ANC that's not the ANC? That's not in the center of the way we imagine politics in this country. And I don't know. And I don't know what that means for youth political identity as well. Because as a young person that might have been inclined to the ANC before, where do you find yourself? You're kind of just floating in limbo, hoping that the party like rectifies itself And also knowing that it's probably not going to happen in the near future, but then what are you supposed to do in the meantime? Because you still want to be politically active in that way. I hope that Congress might be able to answer that, and comrades that end up going, Zuko, I hope that those conversations might happen. The other thing, and I'm going to just make 3 more points because I would like us to talk to each other, is do young people accept our current political system? So the idea of parties, the idea of party dominance, the way we play politics in this country, do young people accept it? And it's the same question with democracy, right? The idea of how we govern this country, and the idea of voting. Do we accept the system as legitimate? And if we don't, how do we then participate in something that we don't consider legitimate? So we always have this conversation around election time when people say that they're not going to vote. And we start with Nelson Mandela guilting because, guys, Mandela died for you to vote, right? 27 years, and how can you not vote? When Mandela guilt is over, then we go into apartheid guilt. If you don't vote, the DA will win and they'll bring apartheid back, right? I have no idea who that works on, but maybe it does. When that's done, then we get into inaccuracies. If you don't vote, you can't complain, which is obviously not true, because you don't lose your citizenship by not voting. Sorry. And so when all of that is said and done, no one is sitting and thinking about how not voting is a legitimate practice as a young citizen. If you don't feel anyone represents you, but also if you don't feel like the system itself is a legitimate one, why must you participate? And so if you have a bulk of young people that feel that way, what do you do? So how do we think about an ANC that young people might outrightly reject? Or how do we think about a political system that young people might outrightly reject? These are all questions. I mean, you can answer the questions later because I don't have the answers. I was just posing questions. The last 2 things I would say is, what is the role of the political party? So the African Union had a regional consultation in Tanzania in September. And that was a big part of the discussion there about can we imagine a world without a political party? If we banned all political parties forever, what would our politics look like? So, and the conversation shifted into, okay, well then what is the role of political parties in our country? And for me, if the role of political parties is just to contest elections and to be part of that electoral cycle, we're wasting time, right? If you followed the recent court case that My Vote Counts ran about political party funding and having political parties disclose who their funders are, one of the big things that came out of that was just the amount of money that political parties get from the state. And lots of countries don't do this, right? Lots of countries don't give political parties money because you must figure it out on your own. We're one of the countries that do. Billions and billions and billions of rands gets given to political parties to do what? And so if all your party is doing is contesting elections, you're wasting resources and you're wasting our time. Because I think that we're able to think about elections and think about governance outside of the political party space. I don't think we need a party to decide who can run this country, personally, right? And so I think what's important in the ANC's role going forward and what becomes of the ANC going forward, I don't think the ANC is dead, not at all. I think the ANC is critical but stable.
Mandela passed away
yesterday,
So critical,
but it was Sabuka's birthday, so we'll celebrate that. So I think the ANC is in a very critical position, but then, stable still, not dead. I think there is space for the ANC to fix itself. But what does that require? And for me, one of the first things is, what is the role of the ANC in this country? And that must be a role that's thought about outside of elections. It can't be that the party just exists to win elections. The final thing is thinking about how do we create politics that's youth-friendly. And for me, this is kind of something that I want to think about specifically to the ANC. Is firstly, what are the things that the ANC needs to unlearn? What are those practices in the ANC and the cultures in the ANC that is making it more critical than it should be? And how is it that we reimagine and rethink and change the party, and this is on all fronts, the Women's League, the Youth League, all of that, to actually be something that people can believe in again? Because I think that's one of the biggest things, is that people might not be thinking about the governance issues of the country, right? In the way they're thinking about supporting the ANC or not supporting the ANC. I think a lot of it is, do we believe that this party is still what it used to be? And for lots of people, that belief is gone, right? It's existential and it's like sentimental. So it might not be a policy angle that you're taking, but it might just be like, I can't see myself in this party anymore. And so how is it that the party must change to become that thing that it either used to be, or how does it create a new identity out of that? Specifically looking at things like the Youth League, how is it that you separate yourself as a youth league, but when you look at the Youth League and you look at the big party, you can't see a difference between the two? So if you're separated as a youth league, how are you different? And how is it that you've become the thing you're supposed to differ from, right? And so what are the things that needs to be undone? What is the cultures that needs to change within the ANC in order for it to be something that people can believe in again? I'm going to leave it there because we're running out of time now.
Yeah, you still have some 5 minutes.
How many?
About 6 minutes.
6 minutes. It's fine. We'll give it to everyone.
Yeah, I'll give it to, we'll democratize the minutes, yeah. I think it was quite interesting. Thanks very much for the insights to all the panelists. I think they are beginning to help us think very hard about what we take for granted, which is to say that if you need to change society, you've got to contest power through a political party. I think that's the essential message, even though you also still have confidence in the ANC that it may be revitalized if 1, 2, and 3, as you have proposed the program of revitalizing the ANC. If that works, then the ANC may come back. But I think generally there are bigger questions about the alternative that is being presented. And I think it needs to be problematized because there has been attempts in the South African context to organize outside the political party. If you look at the new movements, the so-called new movements, we had the anti-privatization forum, we had the landless movement. Others are still there. But what's happening with organizing outside the political party? I think that's a question that we need to question and try to interrogate it within the narrative that has been presented, which is to say politics is not only about the party, but it's also about other ways of organizing outside the political party. But I'm just trying to push all the panelists to think about what has happened about an attempt in South Africa to organize outside the party, because that attempt has been there. And I can tell you the results have been disappointing. So we need to be a bit critical about exactly how does it help us in moving forward, because we can always do the same thing and there'll always be more problems. And the second part is about the relationship with state power. I know you tried to sort of indicate that they don't have to contest state power. So I'm just trying to think what becomes the art of changing society without being in state power. How should this organizing outside the party work in relation to the state power? I think as I take more questions, I think I would like you to reflect on that and then and give some perspectives there. So I'm going to allow some few hands of those who want to comment and those who want to ask questions. Can I note hands? Please introduce yourself so when they respond,
Hi everyone. My name is Ntombentle. I am from Ward 51, Zola in Soweto.
Oh, okay.
The three panelists have spoken about very, very sensitive issues. First of all, Uzuko spoke about the historic part of the movement, right? And I'd like to say, I think that's just my perspective, my opinion. When they initially started the party, they had all the good ideas and everyone was for the people and, we're going to do this and this for our nation. And I think once the money started coming in, people's ideas changed of how are we going to run this country. who's going to run the country, who's going to do this, who's going to watch the kids, how do we fix the educational system from the apartheid regime to now, how do we take these kids moving forward, right? Because now the money started coming in. So maybe if they just focused on the good of the people, on what they want to do for us, the nation, things would have been different, right? And moving on, Opinion spoke about the 3 approaches. I'd like to say, Mina Pindi, I think the cannon fodder approach is really, really true when it comes to ANC. But I think that's how they capitalized on. Okay, we'll give them grants. I promise you, we'll go to the township and perform rallies and give them free T-shirts and free drinks, and do you know what I'm saying? And then those people will vote for us. And most of the time, those rallies happen my elections.
Yes.
Do you understand what I'm saying? So why can't they focus on us every day and say, these are the people that give us bread? Because obviously now they're in it for the money, right? These are the people that give us bread. Let's try and get abantwana abancane to understand.
Yeah.
You spoke about change. These kids, they grow up with the cannon fodder approach mindset. Uguti, I'm going to get a handout from the government. That's how it is. Do you understand? I'm personally, I've got 2 kids. I try to give my kids different, to say, guys, you can be a lawyer. You can become the president of the country. You know, think big. You know, let's try and build a more ambitious South Africa, a goal-driven South Africa, starting from the young kids, because they are our future. Tina, la, like, I think, I'm not going to say we are damaged goods, but the damage has already been done. Do you understand what I'm saying? So let's just try, from preschool up. Give them a different mindset to say, guys, you can be whatever you want to become, because it's been killed. Nobody has ambition anymore, right? And coming to what she spoke about.
Pale.
Pearl.
I can be she, it's okay.
No, I thought you
She spoke about 3, I think those are the 3 most important points when it comes to politics. You know, what draws young people to a certain political party. She spoke about the ANC Youth League. I'm part of the ANC Youth League. Join ANC, Le Pezul, you'll only find 50 years up.
Yes, true.
50 is very young, actually. Yes, you're right. Do you understand? We do join the ANC because my grandmother grew up. I grew up knowing the ANC. Do you understand my point? But where does it take me? Where am I going to go with it? Do you understand my point? Okay. And she spoke about, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask the question or maybe get her to elaborate more about policies. I understand, if I understood you correctly, you said that if we could have probably a policy committee that implements policies for the country outside of a certain political party. I think that might work. I don't know how or why or when, but I think that might work. Having people that can run the country for the political parties, just get them to be the face of, you know what I'm saying? And she spoke again about the role of political parties in the country, in our lives. Mina, I'm blank. I'm sorry. I don't see them doing anything for me. I don't see them doing anything for my children or the future. You know, they must just come back to us and say, guys, this is what we are going to do for you, and stick to those promises. Not just promise us izinto while towards the elections, and then after we've voted, and then nobody cares anymore. Do you understand? And how do we create a youth-friendly politics? That's very, very important. Very, very important. Because if we lose Tina Manje interest in politics, what are our kids going to do? It's over. It's finished. So I'd like to say, let's just try and build a more ambitious South Africa and get our politicians to stand by their words?
The first one is really to speak to the issue of us realizing that our society is evolving. The democratic project or the democratic state that we try to build post-1994 has been going through a process of evolution. And this evolution is best found in a population dynamic that says to us that the majority of, or not the majority, but an overwhelming majority of our society is comprised of young people. And I think perhaps to the credit of the ANC, they have begun to theorize about this. I think discussion documents going to the 53rd National Conference spoke about the phenomenon of the youth bulge, and went on further to expand on what are the defining features of this youth bulge and how does it come about. And they speak to something to the effect that developing nations or developing countries reach a particular point where they have these population dynamics where it's either the population is too young, or in developed nations the population is extremely old, or the median age is extremely high. So therefore it's undeniable the fact that we politics can't exist without youth, first and foremost. And also that we have reached a point where indeed young people must become agents of change. Not necessarily in the classical way that Pindi would put it, of the motive force. That is a different concept, and I'm not speaking about that, but youth component, the youth component in its current form, and as society moves, or the South African society moves, will continue to be a dominant part of society. But we've not been able to respond to how do we mobilize youth, how do we speak to their issues, etc., etc. Partly because we're also grappling with another evolutionary challenge, I think, that says that the history of this country has been underpinned by a particular power base, which is racial in nature, etc., and gendered as well, male dominant, white male dominant, and there is an increasing, I think, at a political level and at an elite level amongst black people, of not being able to grab or come up with ways of deposing this former historical superpower base that is still existing currently. It still exists, which is creating another contradiction. And so long as those contradictions are not dealt with, older people will continue to want to hog the space instead of promoting young people or allowing space for young people. We say this as a South African Youth Council in the province. We interact with government, and we say to the Premier, for instance, that there's a cluttered hierarchy in Gauteng provincial government that is dealing with youth development, because you have these old people who are youth development practitioners, etc., etc. How do they relate with me?
Exactly.
Or what I need, you know? And even when you speak to them, there's that attitude that you know. And we're not going to get youth development or empower young people or take young people out of the position that they're in now.
Yeah.
And it's that contradiction, the contradiction that perhaps borrowing from the history of the ANC, that when Mandela, Sisulu and them went to engage President Nkrumah, and he just could not understand what they were saying, because there was just a contradiction of doing things and so on and so forth. So we need to move towards a conversation that is concrete and is able to address the challenges of young people and how we mobilize young people. For instance, I mean, if I am a youth league leader, like Zuko is, or let's say Kometemba is a youth league leader, and Kometemba goes and engages a young person with the brush and the chisco, and I come with my haircut, which is youthful. Surely, you know, young people will be able to want to interact with me in a better way than they would. You know? How we structure our organization, organizationally. You know, of course, some of us do have a background, and we are from the movement, or members of the youth league, or members of the YCL, etc. You know, our forms of organization, the things that we do, the things that we focus on, just don't appeal to young people. Our conversations are not appealing to young people. I was scolded once by some SACP comrades. So I was running a political education session, and I had there's a video of J-Cole speaking about capitalism and so on and so forth. And they were saying, no, but you can't play this American. You know, I was asking, who must I play then? Because this is the audience. These young people who we are leading listen to J-Cole. So I'm saying to you, the forms of mobilizing, the forms of communicating need to change. I'm one for the idea of organizing outside of political formations, especially on issue-based perspectives, because I think civil society, or the civic organ of our country, has been also kind of captured to a certain degree. But our own comrades, you know, are not able to move out of the ANC and raise an issue in society, mobilize people around this issue, and allow maybe an NPO, an NGO to develop and do certain things. It won't take you away from your organization, but also internally you'll be viewed as if you are a sellout, or, you know, there's that blanket approach that we have that, you know, NGOs, whatever. And the last point I want to make is that, linked to these issues, I think our movement and our leaders in the main going to this ANC conference, I've reached a point of stagnation in the way they approach things. And this can be best described in the SACP discussion document, Going to the Roots, which is giving a critique and an analysis of the political economy, which is still in the main the same basis for a critique and analysis of the political economy that existed in Morocco in 1969. You know, there's no real tangent or strategic shift that can help us to address. That's why we are struggling with policy and many other things to change, radically change policy, you know, because there's a stagnation. And that is captured also in the strategies and tactics of the ANC from Mafikeng right up to now. So it's 20 years now. So it's 4 different conferences that we're going to, where there's no radical tangent. We're not saying we must deal with the core concept of the NDR. That's key, we agree with it, it's fundamental, it's important. But how do we then change this society? How do we change the economy? How do we change society? How do we change how we do things in legislature, for instance? You know, the ANC is being moved by small things, PR representation, still dealing with us today. You are winning wards, all the wards. The ANC has won all 52 wards in Soweto, but they're not in charge of the city. You know, and those are small things. So I think these are some of the things. I'm raising them. I'm also trying to pose them as questions to the panelists. Maybe they can elaborate. So, thanks.
My name is Ponzi. I'm a co-founder of the Compact Events and Entertainment. Okay, my point will be based on the lady directing to you. About, do we need a president or a political party to run the country? To me, my point of view, I'll say yes we do, but not necessarily we do. Because at some point, like, if one president can run a country and failing all the 9 provinces, like, what will be, and never mind the corruptions and everything. So to me, my mind is running like suggestions and everything. So it's about rethinking Africa, right? So if we can rethink Africa in a way whereby 9 provinces could have parties like presidential leadership, not premiers, not councillors, not those mayors or something, because there's too much corruption in ANC. But there could be like point whereby that political party, whether it's ANC, EFF, they've got that presidential leadership that is leading Northwest alone, and it got sub-departments inside of it. It can be any part of it, so that they can run the budgets, everything according to the improvement of South Africa. Because we don't need a signature to destroy, but we need many signatures to destroy. So each and every provinces can just take at least one presidential leadership. Let's say Northwest has its own presidential, and there'll be whereby a headquarter whereby they'll be meeting like we do and suggest in my province I did this and this and that. Because premiers are under oppressed, actually they're oppressed by people who are in big seats and everything, so they don't see the necessity of being like, even now, you know, some of us here don't know who are our premiers and who are our councillors, because I'm not really into politics, but what I see now is that we failing because of we directing things in a wrong direction, whereby we could just suggest things that can come to bring improvement. Why we can do this, and how can we do this? We only do the signature that has upper head, that cannot be corrupted by all the behind us. You see, there should be sub heads and sub, like those people who are underneath, but they can still influence. Yes, ANC Youth League is there to influence ANC to say, okay, this is the direction we can take specifically for youth. We are the future, guys. And rethinking for Africa, without youth, we got nothing. So if we can bring presidential leadership for each and every province and sub-departments for each and every ward and something like that, we can go forward. I don't know how do you see it, but one president cannot run the whole 9 provinces and be successful in everything. It can't be. So I'm from Northwest, guys. I saw everything Northwest. All the tenders, all the municipalities, they failing us. So they, you know, like I didn't do political science or analysis, but what I know is that the water is there, but we're struggling with water. So for tenders to benefit, they have to cut out the water. So it's something that is whereby somebody sees their own benefit, solely own benefit. So it's something that is not going to benefit the whole country or the whole province or something. So we need people who can change the direction of that tender, something like that. So please, guys, we don't need to fight or need to point fingers, but we need people who can take courage and say, we can do this, we can take Northwest. And then those people can meet once in a month and say, this is what I did in the country. And people will be saying he's lying because we don't see the people. That's why we put input as people, because we are the government. So why should we wait for one president to say, give us the speech, budget speech? They'll give Northwest 3 million rand to do like roads, everything, like to change everything. But it will end up nowhere. There will be Apollos, but there won't be lights. So what will be the use? So there has to be those sub-departments that will meet up, and there'll be like head conference whereby people are saying, I did this with the money that you gave me. I did this with the money. Because guys, I work with sleeps. So without a sleep, which means something wrong happened. Like, so if you can produce a sleep for your province, or you can produce a budget, let's say outcome, feedback of what you did and what you did not do. So these are things that there won't be so much of a delay. And the president can be the person who still overstep again, say, this is what we do, this is what we do. Go and do it in Northwest, go and do it in, so that the suggestions and everything in the mind can spread. This is a country, this is our country, guys. We need it. once again, I think it cost 0 cent to become a political person, right?
Shouldn't, yeah.
So I believe that me as a person who
No,
doesn't
Quincy,
know
I
what
think-
is ANC,
Yeah.
how did ANC come out, like how did it grow up and everything, and
Yeah.
I become and I get an upper seat. It's something else, guys. You cannot take somebody who's uneducated with the political thing to come and lead you as a person who studied political science, who studied everything. So there's something that we need to do. I think we need to come with that thing of suggesting there should be a study for whereby we teach people about how do we go with the political thing, how do you rule, how do you lead, because using a bureaucratic and participative leadership is
I
best.
think, sorry, I think I'm going to request that you summarize.
Okay, all right.
Just in
Okay.
less than 30 seconds.
I don't know about ANC, what leadership is it using? Is it a charismatic or is it a participative or is it a bureaucratic? Because I think it's everything in all.
And one, yeah.
So it's best if we can suggest ANC to suggest studies for people who don't know how political works to have studies and they can pay for it, because when you use a t-shirt is something else.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So you're saying there is water, but there's no water. Yeah, it's bad. Yeah. Won't allow the panelists just to respond. Time permitting, I may just take one set of hands and we'll conclude. I know now interest has been generated. The second set of hands is going to be, I will assume, more hands.
One of the key things that I must say I was picking up even from the panelists and how we frame these questions is that there seems to be a problem in South Africa of misunderstanding the relationship between electoral politics and politics as a function of identity. And that is part of the misunderstandings that people have in interpreting the ANC. When I started, I said the ANC did not emerge as a political party, but as a sociological institution. And that is what informs the ANC's dominance. The people of South Africa are not unaware of the problems that they have relating to service delivery and so on. But those things do not inform their identity. So the ANC's capacity to sustain its dominance is not because of the ballot. It's because you cannot disentangle the idea of the ANC from the public imagination of what constitutes political identity in South Africa. And I think this is what then makes these alternatives that have been emerging in the past 14 years to fail. It's very possible for people to join you in a treatment and action campaign for ARVs without really divorcing the concept of the ANC in other areas of life.
Yeah, that's correct.
So I think this imagination that therefore an alternative is naturally an alternative to displace the ANC is what has been failing in South Africa. Are South African people really interested in displacing the ANC from office, or they want an ANC that works differently? That is the real question that people are failing. And the bulk of political analysts proceed from a very arrogant and snobbish perspective that the people of South Africa can't think. It's only us in urban middle-class spaces that can think on their behalf. And that is partly why all these political parties that have emerged trying to contest the ANC have been failing to achieve. South Africans are not looking for someone who's going to come and say to you, you need water. They know they need water, as he puts it. South Africans are trying to understand how can the ANC connect the need to provide water with the need to affirm themselves as black Africans, as people who are in charge of this country. I come from a village. Every time we talk to elders there, including, by the way, people who are our age, they always say to me, you comrades, this is how they refer to us, you comrades are killing our ANC. So they see the ANC as a collective public property, not as the property of politicians. But every other political party that has emerged in South Africa has been the private property of its leader. Can you sustain the idea of the EFF without the personality of Julius Malema?
No.
That's a question that people have got to deal with. Can you sustain the idea of the UDM without the person of Bantu Olomisa? Can you sustain the idea of COPE without the grievance over the recall of Thabo Mbeki? Can you sustain the idea of the African Democratic Change Party without the personality of Makosi Kos? But the idea of the ANC transcends even Nelson Mandela. It transcends Oliver Tambo, it transcends John Dube, it transcends these people because it was not imagined as a representation of the greatness of the person. It was a collective identity that has been asserted over time. And this is the sociological power of the ANC that many people are misunderstanding. The ANC's idea was shaped and formed by South Africans themselves, and it is still defended by them. Every political party that is seeking to affirm itself in South Africa is actually gauged against the idea of the ANC. Anyone who comes and says, vote for me, the question is always saliently posed, are you sustaining the grand idealism of the ANC or not? This is partly why the ANC is not going to lose 2019. The ANC is not going to lose elections in 2019 precisely because the people of South Africa unvoted the ANC in 2016 by pulling away from the ballot. Because they were demonstrating the capacity to reclaim their ANC from leaders. Talk to them. Don't just watch TV. Talk to people like us. They say, no, this is our thing, but the leaders are collapsing it. So the leaders have got to now reconnect themselves with our idea of the ANC. That is part of the question that the December conference has to deal with. To what extent do we materially reconnect the reality of the ANC with the idea of the ANC? Mongezi puts it differently. He says, people are speaking about radical economic transformation with monopoly capital and so on. But we are indifferent because we don't understand these things. This is because there's been a social distance that has been growing between the ANC as leadership and the people that the ANC claims to be representing. And this has been part of our strategic weakness as an organization. And I think one of the things that the National Conference will have to address itself to, and I hope it does, is how does a person sitting in Ezola benefit from land expropriation without compensation in practical terms? So how do you transform that from a slogan into a practical program that each and every person can see as a visible benefit arrangement? It will be interesting to understand how that goes. I will also be going to the conference, but not as a delegate. I will be a bureaucrat, so I will not have the voice to speak and verbalize these things. Here is the other thing. There's an accepted notion that the ANC is practicing patronage politics. That the ANC is an organization that says, join us because I will give you a job and so on. But there is a twist to this. Pearl says, if you join the DA today, you are most likely going to be a ward councillor. Who's practicing rent seeking between the ANC and the DA in that context? Essentially, it means the DA is the one that says, join me because I'll make you a councillor. So the crisis of corruption in South Africa is not a crisis of the ANC. It's a crisis of the system of power. It is a system that is defined and modeled by rent seeking and patronage. So I agree when we say, let's rethink the framework of politics in South Africa. It's not about rethinking the ANC only, it is about rethinking the entire political framework. How can we do this? Because all these political parties, I normally say, by the way, almost all the political parties that exist in South Africa are an expression of one tendency in the ANC over the other. None of them is an original idea. All of them, in their organizational systems, they almost model the ANC. And how they understand power, they almost model the ANC. If you look at how even the EFF is designed as an organization, they have the same process of how accountability is done. There's a branch general meeting, there's a regional congress, there's a provincial congress, there's a national congress. So the relationship between the people on the ground and the decision-making processes of all political parties is very disconnected. Now, that then poses the question of who really sets the agenda in South Africa? Is it the intended beneficiaries of change or is it someone else? Who originated this entire discussion of white monopoly capital and radical economic transformation? Is it the people who are supposed to benefit from change, or it's politicians thinking on behalf of the people themselves? My argument was that this current discourse is a product of the agitation of the Youth League in the 2009 to 2011 period. So in that sense, it was partly a discourse that was engineered by young people themselves. But does the youth have a dominant voice in the ANC today in order to shape this national conference? Again, I had said we as the Youth League are in an existential crisis, and I'll be the first one to own it. I don't think that the outcomes of this national conference substantively will be informed by us as the Youth League because of the sense of disorganization that has affected us over time, right? There's this point that Aiden was making about, what is it called? The fade versus the chiscop as the haircut. It's really the politics of representation and symbolism and so on. To what extent does the deployment of symbols like songs, slogans, dance, form of dress code inform the attitude of the public towards a political party? This, I will frame it in this manner. Many people were very, okay, let me not say many people, because we normally make this sweeping statement that many people this and that. The Zuma phenomenon, when President Zuma was campaigning for election in Pulugwane, he was singing. And many analysts were very annoyed and irritated by this thing. They said it exhibits backwardness, you can't have a modern politician who sings about Umshiniwam and so on, right? This is partly because we tend to impose our own biases as the reality of the public and how the public understands politics, right? Sometimes politicians have to deploy symbols that resonate with the thinking of the people themselves. So that is why a fade would be much more effective than a chisco, right? Because when you have that fade, the person sees themselves in you. Sometimes people don't vote because they need a job or free water and so on. I normally ask, what would a person who is a middle class South African go to the ballot to do? What motivates them to go and vote when they don't need free services, they don't need this and that, they have a job? They still go to vote, but what informs their voting? This is where identity politics come into the fray, and we don't pay attention to these things. That sometimes people are not really aggrieved with political parties because the political parties are not delivering. For instance, in my village, I would tell you since 97 at least, every 3-year cycle there's a mega project in my village. We've always had electricity, the telecom phone lines, roads, water, and so on. So the idea that the ANC is in crisis because it's not delivering services is not entirely true. The ANC delivers services in many places. But the problem is that the ANC is no longer articulating itself in a manner that resonates with the sense of confidence of the people themselves. People are increasingly getting a sense that we are talking to ourselves and not to them. And I think partly that's what the National Conference has got to fix. After we ran around the whole year insulting each other, calling this one a stooge of white monopoly capital, calling this one a stooge of the Guptas and so on. When we turn around in January, what are we going to be saying to South Africans and not ourselves? And I think that is what the ANC has got to deal with. One last point that I think I recorded from you, Masondo, on the issue of alternatives and how they are not sustainable. The ANC's organizational strength is underestimated by people who are not from the ANC. The ANC's organizational design is the most powerful thing that has been developed by the South African political system over the years. The ANC exists in the most remote rural area in South Africa. But the issue-based organizations are actually normally mobilizing urban sentiments only. Very few of them are dealing with the issues as diverse as they are. If people talk about land, for instance, how often do they organize rural people around the forms of land ownership that exist in different parts of South Africa? The tendency is to frame our struggles in a manner that makes sense only to us as people who live in urban settings. And then we hope that we can impose them on virtually everyone who's a South African, who's a voter, and so on. Rural voters are not voting for the ANC because it patronizes them, but because how the ANC is organized, it allows them a sense of belief that their voice is heard. There is no difference between a community mass meeting and a branch general meeting of the ANC in many spaces, because the ANC itself is collectively owned by the people as though it is a community platform. So those people in that space of theirs, the ANC actually gives them real dividends. If they're complaining about water in a BGM of the ANC and in a community meeting, when the ward councillor fixes that water problem, it is the ANC that fixed that problem because they organized there, right? And there's no other political party that has this capacity to entrench itself in the everyday lives of the people. One. The second issue was the Women's League. This is my last point about the Women's League and the concept of politics and what political parties offer outside the ballot, right? When the Women's League goes to a family where someone has passed away, it's not going to the ballot. It is going to the community, right? It goes and says, we heard that so-and-so has passed away and this family is struggling and these are groceries that we are presenting here. And those are everyday politics. So the Women's League is not as useless as people want to make it out to be. You might believe that the president of the Women's League, you don't like her, she can't speak and so on. But the Women's League in communities, it exists as a collective property of the people of the community. It gives them groceries when they need them because there's someone who sometimes it does not even bring groceries. The older women in the village come to pray. And these are significant issues to the people who benefit from them. We may insult them sitting here at WITS because we don't benefit from that spiritual reinforcement that the Women's League brings. So it's not true that political parties in South Africa do not offer anything outside the ballot. Look at the university campus as well. There are many people who accessed education because of interventions of SASCO, the Youth League, and so on. Those things are going to shape the attitude of those people towards the ANC for the rest of their lives. Because that was not the ballot. That was a student stranded on campus without a place to sleep, and then SASCO came and said, come sleep in our SRC office, and we'll be there with you. So before the student even gets accepted, the student is given humanity by an ANC-aligned formation. So people are not really voting only for these bread and butter hardcore issues, but it's also how these political instruments of the ANC entrench themselves in the lives of the people. Now, this is what informs the ANC's dominance. It's not just electoral dominance, it's its capacity to entrench itself in the ways of how people live in these spaces. Can anyone else do that better than we do? I've not seen it happening. But that's not to suggest that South Africans are not going to punish us at the ballot. But the imagination that they may punish us by withdrawing and joining another political party, it's far-fetched. What they will rather do, which might happen in 2019, is to drop the vote by not going to the ballot. So the ANC's biggest opposition is actually the ANC. That's my last point. Thank you.
So should I take on some of the questions? I'll start, I think, with this question around, because I think there's a link between what Ntombendle was raising around. I think your argument is that there is some truth to the canon fodder understanding of, and I don't think I can dismiss it completely and say it's not true. I think there are elements, but I, at the same time, share the sentiment around, maybe if you put it in I mean, Zuko calls it the ANC as a collective property of the people. Mm-hmm. The fact that people can say that, but it's ANC, I mean, a lot of people around the 2009 elections, people who were doing door-to-door would say, people are ANC khasi Zuma. It's more than Zuma. Okay, I understand that Zuma, Rimba, so, but ANC khasi Zuma. ANC goes beyond that. And so this question around what makes people so loyal, it's not about a blind loyalty, but that sense of belonging. I don't think the sense of belonging can be underestimated. And I don't think I think it's actually a very progressive thing that people identify a particular instrument and they've got a link to it beyond the ballot. Some people will call it social capital. Like I said, the fact that the ANC consistently shows up even when people are going through strife and all of those things. I mean, there used to be that famous story about a man who joined COPE and withdrew from COPE again and say, but when I die, who's going to bury me? So I want the ANC flag on my coffin, so I'm withdrawing. Well, I mean, I'm not sure about the extent to which that is true, but I think there's an important point about how people identify this organ as theirs. And it's not people who have a membership card. And I think one of the regressive things about the ANC right now, as it is this whole notion that the members own the organization. You're not a delegate, you must sit down. Where is your branch chief? You can't criticize, you must go and join the branch. But nobody says that around door-to-door election time, that where is your branch, You've got people who haven't held a membership card since the unbanning of the ANC. But they are ANC. You ask them whether they're drunk or they are ANC. They wear the ANC T-shirt and they will even campaign for the ANC. And so I think this separation is not only just the leaders and the people, but also this membership sometimes that feels like the organization belongs to them, to the exclusion of ordinary people is problematic. And I think that's one of the dangers that the ANC faces. And very arrogant membership sometimes that even resorts to insulting people about their political credentials, this notion, what are your credentials? And which is a very reactionary notion, and that's why some people actually are withdrawing and think maybe we should just step aside. I think the second issue is we do have the danger of the closure of political space in South Africa. If you look at certain areas in South Africa, if you look at the deaths and the assassinations that have people who organize in social movements and even people in the ANC, but if you look at the trials and tribulations of Abahlali baseMjondolo and the extent to which those comrades, almost every 2 weeks there's a press statement. So people have been killed, people have been shot because they're questioning the way things are going and they're saying maybe the ANC is not the only way. So this closure of democratic space, I think, is something that we have to defend. We have to oppose, and whether you are in the ANC or not, I think there's a great loss that will come to the people of South Africa if this democratic space is closed down, because that's when the wrong people actually rule and we don't have a voice, none whatsoever, and we don't have instruments to basically articulate our politics. And so I think the other reason, aside from this notion of belonging, social capital that the ANC provides, I think, and I think Zuko, you're starting to touch on it, there is also people underestimate the extent to which the ANC social programs, and that's not the same as patronage, you see. The social programs have made a difference in ordinary people's lives. I mean, there are many other examples. You go to Dagakral, which is 3 hours from here, in Mpumalanga, where I used to play on those streets, and I was shocked when I went to bury my grandfather, my babomngan, and found the streets paved, okay, there's toilets there, it looked like a very different place. And so I think people underestimate, there are not many governments that can tell you about 3 million housing, low-cost housing for the poor. It's big, and those social programs, it's not patronage, it's not handouts. And by the way, when ANC adopted some of these things, there were people who were opposed to it.
Them,
The same DA didn't actually believe that you should be doing that for people in South Africa. You shouldn't be extending housing and all of those. There are many people today who say, but we have first generation graduates in our family, and all. It's that NSFAS thing that they studied with and all of those things, which has been expanded significantly, from TEFSA, but expanded significantly. Fine, it can't keep up with the rising cost of higher education and all of those things, but those social programs are also very important. And I think sometimes middle class people forget some of those things. It's easy to dismiss it. If you stay in a gated community, the way a gated community, a complex where there's a boom gate, you have to be called intercom. There's a different way in which you look at the state and what the role of the state is in your life. Because there's a body corporate there that collects your levies and will collect your dustbins and make sure it's clean, will cut your grass and all of that. There is a security company that takes care of your needs of safety. So you don't have to rely so much on the South African police. But also you can pay money to the insurance to make sure that your household contents, you can see I know these things, eh? Your household contents are taken care of, and when you go on holiday for a long time, nobody's going to come and break in. And so the state, you look at the state differently. Maybe you will be very worried if you're black and middle class, you'll be very worried when there are announcements about interest rate hikes, because you're going to lose that house that you've just bought with that bond. So your interests may be different, which is why I think, Aidan, your point is important about, I think you were saying the strategy and tactics hasn't shifted, or the analysis hasn't shifted. I think we need to go back to the drawing book and understand the different ways in which people walk into struggles and what people's interests are. So people who stay in gated communities are not necessarily, we shouldn't necessarily dismiss them and say they're not a motive force, but we must understand what brings them into the political space and what their interests are, and that those interests will be different to someone who's fighting evictions because rents are too expensive in the cities, or because the red ends are on people's necks for not paying rents and all those things. So I think that's important. And then this question around the state and what the state means to different people is important in light of Themba's question about the relationship with state power. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I believe in a perspective of politics that is inside the state but also goes beyond it and organizes outside. So I think the ballot is important. I think contesting state power is important, but I think that certain things that only a state can do, right? If you're talking about a big mining company that wants to raid people's land or to mine it and push people off the land and all those things, people can wage fight backs with their movements and all those things, but the state is also important for that pushback and to actually take a stance. So if you've got a state that's occupied by progressive people, you can actually successfully discipline the way business conducts itself, or capitalists conduct themselves. So I think it would be very wrong to actually say, leave the state alone, let's just work outside of the state, outside of electoral politics. I think that's when actually you give the upper hand to the powerful and the wealthy and the right wing in this country. So I think the state and the post-94 state represented something to the people. That slogan of a better life for all, I don't think it's something that we can take for granted. People actually saw the ANC's entry into the state to change the rules of the game, to deal with oppressive social conditions, to address the question of racism in South Africa, and to put the majority first. So the state is quite central to how actually people imagine themselves and their being and all of that, and also to access certain things. But of course, I'm not sure if the ANC is still changing the rules of the game in the state. I'm not sure if that's what's happening, and I suppose this conference must also respond to those questions. I think the question around, the counter-hegemonic organizations, or the organizations that also present themselves as an alternative, your Anti-Privatization Forum, and many other organizations which were born in the 2000s, which challenged the prepaid water meters in the townships, the commodification of electricity with prepaid electricity meters, and all of that, were all very encouraging. And there was a time when actually many analysts were saying, these are the pallbearers to the ANC, they're carrying ANC to the ground to bury it, and new politics is emerging. But things turned out differently. And I think we must ask ourselves, why is that the case? I can guess a number of things, but some of these organizations, because the problem sometimes is our politics and the way we do politics, some of the things that we cry about and we complain about with the ANC reproduce themselves in those spaces. So when you've got leaders who take advantage of their positions of power and actually sexually harass young women in those organizations, there have been stories to that extent in those organizations, where you've got now money determining the politics in those organizations and access to funders and all of those things, where you've got a whole range of problems, right? And I think I would also agree with this notion about these other organizations that also question the way things are run, but are not necessarily counter-hegemonic in the sense that they're not necessarily saying, don't want capitalism must fall today. But they are saying that we need to use the Constitution of South Africa to ensure that the people get good quality public education. So you've got equal education, which is actually today, in public discourse, has displaced COSAS, which is the traditional organization of students at high school level. Or the treatment, I think the treatment action campaign was successful to some extent because its social base was also ordinary people. The people themselves. And they actually were successful in even branching out of the urban areas. But the treatment action campaign was also, there was a debate within about whether do we vote for the ANC if we don't get treatment and IRVs? Are we going to vote? And they actually discussed it internally and came to the conclusion that no, people must be free to exercise and to vote. And they couldn't take that stand because the majority, the social base of the TAC were people who still believed in this idea of the ANC and all of that. A few weeks ago, there was a meeting organized around the crisis of the train or the railway system in South Africa. And as people were reflecting, they were saying, but we left others back at home, our comrades, because they said, okay, you're fighting for the trains to work better. And this is in Cape Town, to work better and all those things. But actually, you're fighting the ANC. Why are you fighting? So this separation is something that in my head, I'm just still also battling with. I don't think a politics that says to people or pokes people on the forehead and say, you are reactionary because you are in the ANC, leave the ANC. And I don't think that politics will succeed in South Africa. I think a non-sectarian politics that accepts that the ANC holds a special place in people's hearts, but that doesn't mean that we can't work together to fight this issue or that issue, and maybe at some point combine those issues to something else is more promising than this one about poking ANC supporters on the forehead and reminding them that they're sellouts, as if it's them who are in the state and running things. I think, yeah. And then I think lastly, I won't touch on everything because I'm also sensitive of time. I think this idea that was raised by, I think, Mongezi, I interpret your question in a slightly different way. And I think you were sort of raising something that, is it Khontsene? That you were raising about, well, I mean, people talk about these things, white monopoly capital, radical economic transformation, what is that? And a part of me also feels like sometimes we use difficult words and big words to depoliticize. They're supposed to be political, but it's also to basically say politics is not your space, here's the line. If you can't articulate yourself in this way, and you can't talk about the national democratic revolution, then you don't have a space, you can't articulate your views. But if we understand politics to be something that allows us to fight for our freedoms, and we center the everyday experiences of people in terms of politics, then pontification about white monopoly capital and all of that, we won't necessarily expect people to be pontificating and knowing all these things. And also a progressive politics is one that appreciates theory, because I know theory is important. So it is important to say, what is white monopoly capital and all of these things. But a progressive politics must also appreciate that we don't have ready-made answers. And that good theory is not one that provides all the answers, but it's one that asks the important questions. And that people can work together to actually find those answers, as opposed to us deferring and say, they are the politicians who know everything, let's give them everything, and then ask the people of the ground, we'll wait for delivery. So there's this need to re-engineer how we think of politics. I think politics is for everybody, because my definition of politics is quite broad, and I don't think that people should know everything. I think there's a space for consciousness raising and educating one another, but I don't think that there should be a card to say, okay, you don't know, therefore you can't speak. And I appreciate the sentiment around education and maybe professionalizing politics. I think we should also be careful about the unintended consequences of having, because then inadvertently it becomes a very middle class conversation where the people who've got access to WITS, UCT and other places are the ones now who are at the center stage of politics, and they may be young people. It's interesting, but young people are also socially differentiated. They don't all, young people are not a homogeneous and all the same. They enter the political space with different interests depending on where they come from, and they've got different concerns. But I definitely do think that young people must shape how we go forward.
Contesting outside of the ANC, and organizing outside state power. And mine is different from people that exist to contest the ANC at the ballot, right? So the first thing that popped into my mind when we started talking about that was Save SA. And I think there's a difference between movements that arise to campaign around an issue and movements that arise to campaign against the ANC. And so something like the Treatment Action Campaign was something that came out as an issue-focused thing. And so it's easier to flourish because whether the ANC exists or not, the issue is there. And you can rally people behind an issue and then you can sustain that support. And if you look at things like Save SA, for example, they exist for moments. And so when there was, the height of the anti-Zuma rhetoric in the country, it was the perfect time for Save SA to come out and carry on with their Zuma must fall thing, because it was a moment. And when the momentum died out, so did Save SA. So right now, Save SA is being absorbed by the Amakarada Foundation to do I don't know what. But it's the difference between... No shade. I genuinely don't know what they're doing. But I think that's the thing about the difference between creating something as a reaction and as an antithesis to something else versus creating something out of the belief in an issue, right? And the thing about organizing outside state power, for me, I think immediately to civil society and civic actors, and how it is that you can change and shape society without necessarily being in government. And for me, I think there's a big policy angle to that. There's a big sort of belief that when policy is created, people's lives must adjust according to that policy. And I think it should actually be the opposite way, is that policy must adjust to reflect people's lives. If people feel so, there's a big debate, and it has been a big debate about recognizing informal settlements as legitimate forms of housing. And it's the idea that your housing policy might not reflect the realities of what's happening in people's lives, but your housing policy also can't meet their needs. And so perhaps their needs and their realities must then shape your housing policy, right? And so I think the relationship between organizing outside of state power and the way policy is informed are intertwined. With what you were saying around political education, I wanted to tie it to what Aiden was talking about appealing to young people. I think young people are educated in different ways politically. And it's in the conversations that you have with people across this country. And so the way we think about politics might not even be called politics. But if you talk to young people about where they come from and what happens in your communities, that's an expert opinion on politics. It's just not using the same words that I'm using, right? And I'll give you an example. We did some work with the World Bank in Kwamhlanga a couple of weeks ago. And we started talking about, we actually started talking about white monopoly capital. And when the conversation started with those words, people were like, we're not interested in that thing. It's always on the news and it's always in the paper, and can we just not? And at some point, the conversation progressed to economic opportunities for young people in the area. And immediately, one of the first things that came out was people were like, we don't speak English that well. And so finding jobs is difficult. And why is that so? No, because if you're going to go to an interview, you can't talk to a white man in Zulu, right? But then why are you talking to a white man? And it was, they own the businesses, so that's obviously who you're going to speak to. That's white monopoly capital, right? And so you're not articulating it the way you're seeing it on the news, but the understanding that there is a system of capital that prevents you from getting access to opportunities based on race is the premise of what WMC is. And so I think we're talking about the same issues, we're just talking about them in different ways. And it's about understanding that all of those ways are valid and all of those ways are right. We don't have to articulate it in the same way for it to be valid. And I think there's a value in being able to speak to people who don't speak politics back to you. It's exhausting talking, like comrades speak all the time. It's really exhausting, and often it's unproductive. But being able to speak to people in a real way about real issues that's not going to make it to a headline of a Sunday paper is where the actual value is. And so I do agree that people are less educated about very important things. But I think they might not be as uneducated as we might think they are purely because they're not speaking the same way we are. Around the cannon fodder thing. So politics is theater, right? Politics is a show. And particularly around election time, it's a circus. There's actually circuses, right? But politics is a performance, and the act of giving out food parcels and all of those things are things that occur across the world, right? It's dodgy, and it's like, it's not great, but it's the game. And I think it might not take away from still those people's ability to choose. So again, we were in Kwaggafontein. That place is far, guys. And that's a community that has taps. So they have the infrastructure for running water, but Kwaggafontein only gets water on a Saturday. So you open the tap and nothing comes out during the week. On a Saturday, you have water. Down the road in Kwamhlanga, they also have taps, but they don't get water at all. A water tank comes in on a Saturday, and you get your water for the week, right? And during election time, there's water the whole week. And so one of the conversations was, do you think you're being bribed with water? And the response was, yes, we are, but we're getting water, so if they want their vote, they can have it, right? So this idea that if people's immediate needs are food parcels and water, and if they feel that they can give their votes away or they can give their vote to you for those things, it's fine, right? People vote for different reasons. People accept different things for different reasons. So the DA might say, don't accept food parcels and don't give them your vote. But the DA is not going in to feed those people either, right? And so as much as it's not very morally correct and it's not clean, it's not as clean and nice as we want it to be, but people formulate their reasons and their decisions for voting based on their immediate needs and who fulfills them. And I think the choice is entirely up to them, right? As much as it's not amazing. The last thing I'll say is, with your thing around creating a federal government system, but tying into what you were saying about having people implement policies outside of government, those people are the government, right? So people that work in government departments are not politically appointed, right? They're bureaucratically appointed. So there's people that apply for jobs and they exist outside of the party. And I think when we think about how government works or doesn't work, a lot of it, we talk about corruption and we talk about mismanagement of funds and all of that. And I mean, so for me, corruption is not like a hobby, right? It's not a national pastime. Like, it's not something that we just do for fun. I think corruption and greed and nepotism comes from a place. And for me, in this country, the first thing is capitalism, right? So capitalism has created competition, and capitalism creates the need for us to constantly seek more. And so if you're in government and you've got access to funds, you're not thinking about how can I use this to better the lives of everybody else. You're thinking about the fact that things are popping off at home and you don't have money. And you want to get ahead and you want to compete economically. And this is an easy way to do it. You've also come from a place where you've had colonialism and you've had apartheid that have worked for you to never access these opportunities. And so when you do, you don't know what to do with yourself, right? And it doesn't excuse corruption. But I think it's disingenuous for us to think about things like corruption as something that just occurs because people feel like it. I think there are very many factors that play into why things work the way they do. And so the idea about creating a more functional state means that how do we create a system where people don't feel the need to be corrupt, right? You create a more equitable society so people are not needing and people are not wanting things, right? And so it's a whole web of factors that interlink. So if you're solving corruption, it might not be about creating more checks and balances, right? The state is extremely bureaucratic already. It's about why are people stealing money? And how do you meet those needs first so that they don't need to steal that money?
Thank you very much to you all and our panelists. It's so refreshing to see young people talking about their future and what is bothering them politically and how do they actually make things happen. I wish this was happening in every village, in every town, this is the way to begin to change the world. Sometimes we expect something big, a rally, but us seated here engaging in a very articulate manner in which we've all done is the beginning of something, you know. And I don't know whether this represents engagement outside the party politics, because you know, political parties, you get called to political schools, and you get told the party line, NDR, those who are in other political parties, 6 cardinal pillars, and this is the line. So the good advantage about this space is that everybody talks their mind, you know, in a way that helps us to envision a new reality and a new future, which belongs to us as the young people.
We are at a dialogue, it's a conversation amongst young people. It's organized by Rethink Africa, which is an organization of young people that deals with issues of socio-economic importance, politics and so on, about how young people understand the world and the country that they live in. Today we were discussing the dominance of the ANC in South African politics, and especially because of the upcoming national conference of the ANC and some of the issues that have been discussed in the build-up to the ANC. The ANC has been coming under pressure, seen of course in the outcomes of the 2016 local government elections, in which it lost key metropolitan municipalities, and this is partly because people now think the ANC faces a problem of corruption, it is not responsive enough, and it's sort of not performing consistently with the ideal that it was formed for. So today we're discussing that, and what are the expectations that we have about the outcomes of the National Conference of the ANC, and whether young people have a role to play in the ANC and outside the ANC in trying to shape the future of South Africa and how we understand the democratic project at large. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Pindile Kunene. I came here to this session basically thinking that we're going to have a rich conversation, but it's probably going to be very middle class, about middle class concerns, not really touching at some of the issues that are at the heart of the challenges facing South Africa today. But I was quite impressed about the young people in the room who were not all towing the same party line. They came from different political backgrounds and political traditions, and what struck me the most is that people were willing to engage and to debate with one another and to disagree with the panelists, but amongst themselves as well. I think one of the key issues that emerged quite strongly is this idea that politics is not only for politicians, and the association of politics so closely to politicians is problematic. People feel like sometimes there's big language, big slogans that are used to exclude people from the political discourse, which I think is one of the key things that I'm taking away, because I think there's a need to rethink and to re-envision politics, so that politics becomes more about the practical needs, the everyday struggles, as well as about changing oppressive conditions, which was, I suppose, what politics of the anti-apartheid struggle was about. But I get a sense that that's being lost, but being here gives me hope that we can resuscitate that.
This is good. Okay, hi. My name's Pearl Pillay, and I'm from Youth Lab, based here in Johannesburg. So tonight's event for me was quite refreshing. I think that it's hard these days to find conversations about the ANC and about politics in this country that don't follow the same narrative that we've seen in the news and in newspapers for the last couple of years, I would say. So being able to break away from the narrative around corruption and Jacob Zuma is really refreshing. And to be in a room of people that care about politics but in ways that are different. And so even in talking about the ANC in a way that is more constructive and in a way that's more forward-thinking, rather than just kind of the gloom and doom narrative that we've been exposed to for so long. So for me, I think a couple of the things that really stood out was people just being able to reimagine the roles that political parties play in our communities, and the idea that political parties exist in this country, at least, to immerse themselves into communities, and the ANC is one of the parties that can do that. But beyond that, what do other political parties serve to do? And so if they're just here to contest elections, then how do we rethink the role of political parties in our communities, but also thinking about young people and politics, and how is it that young people participate, but how do we reimagine what politics look like so that they reflect what young people want? And so how do we open up the political space so that it accommodates young people, and so that young people can find themselves and find acceptance in political movements? So why is it that young people that don't engage in party politics, why is it that they don't engage? And it's not that they're not political. They're still politically active, just in different ways. And so what are their reasons for doing that? And on the flip side, young people that are involved in party politics, what are the things that gets them to opt in, and what are the things that keeps them there, beyond the sort of liberation narrative that we're exposed to? I think events like this are really important. Often conversations like this happen in silos, and happen in spaces where young people aren't represented. And so I think it's important for young people to be able to organize ourselves and have these conversations. It contributes towards the discourse of the country, but it also helps us sharpen each other by learning new things and exchanging ideas. And so organizations like Rethink Africa are really important to be able to facilitate these conversations.
Hi, I'm Bali. I'm part of Rethink Africa. So basically, we decided to host this event because we're an NGO that focuses on youth-related problems. So one of the questions that came up recently was basically surrounding whether or not ANC politics was overshadowing the problems of the country. So that's the basis for this event. We thought it was necessary to give the ANC youth and people from the ANC, or people that have been supporters or not even supporters, a chance to speak in a space where it's not politically affiliated, so that we could hear what the youth of the ANC was saying, because most of it is overshadowed by what the upper body in politics is saying. So we wanted to hear from the students and from young people in general. I think the success of the event came in the form that it wasn't shadowed by student politics, if that makes sense. So in the VIT space, it's very political and very it's very petty almost. And so to hear things and learn something new that you wouldn't have learned in a normal political setting was very informative. I think it was necessary to also highlight that the problems are not specifically just ANC, but that they are the structure of politics, and the way politics is structured in South Africa sort of contributes to the implications that surround the issues that we were discussing today. So yeah.
Thank you.